Welcome all. As you're gathering, we'll invite you to use the chat box within the webinar platform to share where you're based, what organization you're affiliated with, and what excites you for the future of learning. And to find the chat box, if you hover your cursor over the bottom of the screen, you should see a black menu pop up as is shown here with the chat function as well as with the question and answer function. We're inviting you to use the chat box function as we get started. While we're presenting, we'll invite you to use the question and answer function to ask questions. We might answer some straightforward questions in writing as we go along. There'll be two designated question and answer periods when we will pause the presentation and answer questions that you've raised in the question and answer tool. We'll need to use that tool as we're not able to take questions verbally during the webinar. If you're just joining us, welcome, and we'll invite you to use the chat box to share where you're based, what organization you're with, and what excites you for the future of learning. You can find the chat function by hovering your cursor over the bottom of your screen and clicking on chat. There's also a question and answer function there that we'll be using for you to ask questions during the presentation elements of the webinar. So feel free to use that throughout to ask questions, and we will be drawing upon what you type there to respond during two designated question and answer periods. We'll get started in a couple of minutes as you're gathering. If you have just joined us, I'll invite you to share in the chat box where you are based, what your organization is, and what excites you for the future of learning. And you can find that chat function by hovering your cursor over the bottom of the screen. We'll also invite you to use the question and answer function throughout the webinar to ask questions, and we'll have two designated periods where we cease formal presentation and respond to some of your questions.
Thanks to everyone for sharing in the chat box there. I'm Katie King. I'll be monitoring the Q&A box for the first portion of our webinar. And Catherine, as you're starting to kick us off today, we have a range of folks from across the country, people working in ed tech, some in higher education, some in K-12, a lot of people interested in education technology and thinking about how we can rethink what school might look like for transformational purposes.
Excellent, thank you, Katie. As Katie mentioned, I'm Katherine Prince with KnowledgeWorks Strategic Foresight Team, and as you know, we're here today to explore KnowledgeWorks' 5th comprehensive 10-year forecast on the future of learning, which is called Navigating the Future of Learning. Our first 10-year forecast came out in 2006, and since then we've embarked on a robust program of publication and stakeholder engagement, where every 3 years we put out one of these comprehensive forecasts that takes a fresh look at the drivers of change shaping learning and projects what they could mean for education. And then between those, we publish deep dives on specific topics, such as the future of readiness or the future of education change-making, and also publish strategy guides and tools for you to engage stakeholders in your context in considering and planning for the future of learning. In addition to these publications, we work around the country and sometimes beyond to engage stakeholders directly in applying our insights about their future of learning to your contexts. I'll be presenting today alongside Jason Swanson and Katie King. Together we form KnowledgeWorks Strategic Foresight Team, and also with us from KnowledgeWorks are Emily Smith and Kate Westrick from our communications team. Thank you for joining us. We're going to be first looking at the big story of change that Navigating the Future of Learning highlights, and then digging into the drivers of change that we think will impact education over the next decade. After Jason presents on those, we'll pause to take questions in the question and answer function within the webinar platform. And then we'll move on to highlight some of the future possibilities that the publication raises. And again, we'll pause after that to answer questions again, and then we will also be sharing 2 quick polls as we go along. For those of you who are less familiar with KnowledgeWorks or are only familiar with our strategic foresight work, we do this exploration of the future of learning in the context of KnowledgeWorks' overall vision that every student experience meaningful personalized learning so they're ready for what's next. In addition to forecasting the future of learning, we work at the state and federal policy levels to create the conditions supportive of personalized learning and other education innovations. And we also work with schools and districts around the country to help build their capacity to implement personalized competency-based learning and to implement early college high schools. As we explore the future of learning, we're very motivated in doing so because we think that we're all key stakeholders and actors, agents of change in shaping the future of learning. So the future's possibilities that we describe can feel determined, but they're absolutely not. It's impossible to know the future, and we think that by looking ahead, we all have a better chance of steering it in directions that we would prefer. So the aspirations that we set and the actions we take day to day help us create the future that will in fact unfold over the next 10 years. When we created Navigating the Future of Learning, as with other comprehensive forecasts, we used strategic foresight methodologies to identify social, technological, environmental, economic, and political changes, and to look at also what trends, patterns, signals of change, which are early examples of how things might be shifting, how that all comes together to suggest directions of change for education. And we filter through all that secondary research to identify a set of drivers of change that we think are particularly important for education over the next 10 years. So there are many other drivers of change out in the world today beyond those that we will describe, but we pick ones that we think have particular relevance to the field. Once we have those drivers of change identified, we combine them to explore future possibilities that we think are plausible and that could help stretch our thinking about what might be possible and desirable for learning. In this case, with this forecast, we looked at possibilities for educational programs, practices, structures, and roles that could help support healthy development of young people, enable effective lifelong learning, and also foster community vitality. I'll hand over to Jason to take us through some of the content from the forecast.
Sure, thanks Katherine, and greetings everyone. It's nice to see a lot of familiar faces in the chat box. So as Katherine mentioned, our forecast begins really with this notion of a big story of change. And actually the story for this particular forecast is a continuation of the larger narrative of change laid out in forecast 4.0. And that's really that according to our research and many others, we're in the midst of deep change, a change that we call an era shift. Now, an era shift is defined quite simply as moving from one point in history with certain defining features to another point in history with a new set of defining features. And according to our research back from the 4.0 days all the way up through 5.0, one of the major factors really pulling us into this new era is the exponential advances in digital technologies. So because of that accelerating rate of change in the technologies, the defining feature for this new era to us is the need to continually partner with the code in our digital devices to make sense of the world around us. It's the label partners in code. So over the next decade, those exponential advances in digital technologies are really going to require us to redefine our relationships with one another, our institutions, and really even with ourselves. And because this is a large-scale shift, we really believe that every facet of our lives, including how we teach and how we learn, is going to be touched by this new era of partners in code. As futurists, we're believers that we need to be actively engaged with the issues on the horizon, especially now that we're facing such deep and sweeping and accelerating change. So during this period of transition, we believe that education's role in supporting lifelong learning, supporting community vitality, and certainly supporting the healthy development of young people is going to be increasingly crucial. In that many of the organizations, the institutions, and the systems that help to structure our daily lives and that support learning are actually increasingly out of sync with existing needs and emerging needs. So this new era could exacerbate that current misalignment, or it could provide incentives and new frameworks for how we might live, work, and learn together. Remember, as Katherine said, the future's not—
Hi, Jason.
Yeah.
Hi, Jason. This is Emily. I'm getting some messages and hearing that the audio is cutting in and out a little bit. Want to make sure that people are hearing everything that you're saying. Wondering if we can pause for a minute and appreciate everyone's patience while we see what we can get this fixed. But Jason, are you dialed in via your phone or via the computer audio?
The computer audio.
Okay. We may need to switch to dialing in via the phone. And maybe while you do that, we can just take a quick pause, or maybe Katherine and Katie can pick up.
Yeah, that might not be a bad idea. It might take me a little bit.
Okay.
This is Katherine. I can pick up while we're working on the sound quality issues. And if someone can just flag me when they're resolved, you can hand back. Just to recap what Jason was sharing, we think that this new era, characterized by the exponential advances in digital technologies, is a time when we have the need and the opportunity to realign a lot of our education systems, as well as other facets of our life together beyond education. And that education will have the opportunity to play a really critical role in shaping not just happens with learning, but how we answer some of the big questions of our time. So the drivers of change that we see shaping education over the next decade are listed here, and I'll recap each of them briefly, and then we'll spend a little bit more time digging into each of them. And just to make sure everyone's clear, a driver of change is a major societal force that we think will impact education. It bundles up smaller trends and other developments to indicate a trajectory of change that's likely to have a significant impact over the next decade. Briefly, the first driver of change, automating choices, looks at how artificial intelligence and machine learning are increasingly automating many of our choices, creating greater personalization and efficiency in many aspects of our lives, but also raising questions related to trust and bias and individual agency. With the civic superpowers driver of change, we are seeing engaged citizens and civic organizations increasingly use digital technologies to supercharge their efforts to influence the civic sector and try to rebalance power. With the accelerating brains driver of change, we're increasingly have available tools and insights informed by neuroscience that are enabling us to modify our brains and our cognition in intentional ways But we also are finding that some of our engagement with pervasive digital media is altering our brains in unintended ways too. With the toxic narratives driver of change, we're seeing that the narratives and metrics of success and achievement that characterize education and other aspects of life are increasingly detrimental to both individual and societal health. And we're also then, with Remaking Geographies, seeing communities around the country work to remake themselves in face of deep transitions, including economic transitions and environmental change. To take a closer look at automating choices, again, this driver of change has to do with the ways in which artificial intelligence and machine learning are enabling us to create efficiencies and achieve greater personalization in many areas of life. And we're probably all familiar with the impacts of these tools through things like recommendation engines that suggest what books to read or movies to watch or products to buy based on our previous behavior. And we use these kinds of tools for decision supports and when we're looking for directions, or to save a little bit of time when we book an airline ticket and want to send the booking to our calendar, that kind of thing. We're also seeing kind of corporate and organizational uses of artificial intelligence and machine learning with things like Cincinnati, Ohio Fire Department using predictive analytics to kind of decide when they might want to treat an injury on site after an emergency responder call, or when they might want to transfer the person who's injured to a hospital. And we're seeing some police departments use these kinds of tools to anticipate crime. So you can see these tools, as we currently have a lot of power, and as we move forward, we'll continue to do so. We have to be really careful in their uses to make sure that we are not replicating current biases by using biased data, incomplete data, not building in new biases as we build out these kinds of tools and apply them in different settings. So with education, I think there's a lot of opportunity to consider how we might use these kinds of tools to create more personalization, but we also need to consider what we might be giving away, making sure that we're not undermining individual student or educator agency, and making sure that educators are part of kind of a broad societal effort to make sure there's appropriate governance over the ways in which we use these tools in many aspects of life, and especially education. Looks like I can hand back over to you, Jason, for the next driver of change. Jason, are you there?
Am I coming through?
Now you are.
Okay, cool. Yeah, sorry about that, everyone. In the testing, it never quite panned out that my audio wouldn't work. So our next driver is one we're calling civic superpowers. And this really has to do with individuals, nonprofits, and volunteer organizations really beginning to flex their civic muscles in new and novel ways, thanks to accelerating technologies, but also in response to a growing governance gap. So a lot of individuals are working to use technologies such as participatory media, machine learning, and data analytics with hopes of really reweaving a social fabric as things like the social safety net phrase, as faith and trust in the government erodes, and as corporations have really stepped in to sort of fill that void left over by really, as I mentioned, that growing governance gap. So we're beginning to see citizens that are leveraging software bots to do things like automate massive ways of constituent communications to elected officials. So we saw some really interesting signals of change from this, not the least of which is a company called ResistBot, which totally automates this process through a web app where, as a citizen, you can ping an elected official, you could find out who represents you, draft a note and have it mailed or faxed to that representative in less than 2 minutes. So we're seeing this sort of interplay of citizens taking civic participation increasingly to the digital sphere for organizing, but we're also seeing it being played out at the state level. So for instance, the New York City Police Department is piloting using a startup called Elucid, which is a mobile polling application that helps to build trust with residents by doing things like rapidly capturing feedback about their sentiment and their interactions with law enforcement, getting rapid data about how safe they may or may not feel in their community, and generally tapping into a larger and more constant flow of data in order, again, to kind of begin to reweave that social fabric. So these tools have amazing power to supercharge and really begin to influence the civic sector, both for good and for ill, as you can imagine. So despite their promise, the failure here to develop inclusive civic ecosystems comprised of really diverse organizations and populations really could maintain that current imbalance of power and that feeling that maybe that governance gap is insurmountable, and could really allow sort of that corporate sector influence to pervade and shape the conversations about the solutions we might need in the civic sector. So among the many questions that this driver presents education, there's one that I think is particularly interesting. And that's really the question around, how might tech-enabled civic engagement begin to reshape educational governance and decision-making? So what happens when the consumers and products of education systems begin to tap into sort of this supercharged means to engage through governance and sort of civil and civic discourse about what they want out of an education system? Jump one more. So our next driver takes a look at trends both in the technological sphere and also within the consumer sphere and the science domain. So this driver, Accelerating Brains, really begins to look at both trends in terms of digital technologies and the emergence and acceleration of research into how we function as biological beings, specifically at the neurological level. So what we begin to see is people have a willingness to begin to tinker with their cognition, both in intended ways and a lot of times it's happening in unintended ways. So on the consumer science side, we're beginning to see digital technologies intended to treat a wide variety of neurological disorders, stemming from anxiety to PTSD through consumer-facing products such as video games, such as apps, such as we could include meditation apps among them, all the way out to wearable technologies such as things like Sana and Think, which give a low current electric stimulation over the brain to really begin to push people towards more calm, more open states so they can readily control their emotions more easily. So we're beginning to see other technologies outside of the sphere of kind of the consumer facing side of things that are related more towards things like sport. Halo Sport comes to mind. It's a consumer-facing device aimed at doing something called neuropriming, which is a practice of supercharging certain regions of the brain that's particularly popular among baseball players, so that they're able to identify, predict, and swing. They're bad at a much more rapid pace than somebody that has not been through that neuropriming process. But all of these technologies really point towards sort of those intended ways that we might begin to play with our cognition in terms of basically enhancing how we think, enhancing how we learn, and enhancing how we perceive the world. On the unintended side of things, this gets a little bit more interesting in that we increasingly live in a digitally mediated world. And there's a biological price to pay for that almost over-reliance on our digital devices. As we previewed within that big story of change, we are increasingly reliant on the code within our digital devices to make sense of the world around us. And even that can afford deeper insights and more personalized services, there's an emerging body of research really beginning to show the effects of relying on these devices in terms of overstimulating short-term memory at the detriment to our long-term thinking, our critical thinking, and our ability to think abstractly and in multiple narratives. So as this driver continues to unfold, there's a whole host of questions related to things like ethics and equity, but chief among them is what might the ethical and long-term health implications of using neurological enhancement technology be? So Toxic Narratives takes a look at really the epidemic that we've seen in terms of anxiety and depression, not just in young people, but really almost at a global level at this point, but certainly being felt in a very, very pronounced way in the US. So this really has to deal with the fact that our dominant narratives and metrics of success and achievement are becoming increasingly detrimental to individuals and social health and are contributing to a growing toxicity in systems and institutions. So current metrics of success in education, in business, and in media often treat people as assets that are to be optimized both as data points, which are then to be commoditized. So they're contributing to chronic health conditions such as obesity, anxiety, depression, high blood pressure, hypertension. That list, unfortunately, just keeps going on and on. So for adults, we're seeing struggles to adapt to things like demanding work schedules and to the uncertainties of a transitioning economy, right? Adults are faced with huge amounts of economic uncertainty due to the things like the growing atomization of work, which is leading to insecurity, as more adults are having to participate in both the gig and task-based and project-based work. The mental health of teens and young people is also declining. They're facing wide-ranging pressures, including high-stakes testing, growing college admissions processes, and massive amounts of student debt. And the reality that they're increasingly aware that we're teaching them to succeed within a system that's increasingly becoming outmoded. So given these stressors, people are susceptible to losing their positive social connections and those in-person relationships that could provide buffers in times of deep stress and transition. There's a phenomenon of growing or rising social pollution. So if all of this is left unchecked, current narratives and metrics of success could exacerbate really an epidemic of social pollution that could have profound impacts and consequences. So to counter all of this, there are some bright spots. This isn't wholly a downer. We're beginning to see on the academic side a growing number of colleges and universities that are beginning to implement testing optional admission practices. At the K-12 level, we're seeing things like the Mastery Transcript Consortium beginning to develop holistic alternative models for high school assessment and credentialing and transcript generation. So as we look at this driver and sort of this idea of misaligned incentives in times of deep change, one of the most pressing questions that comes to light is really how might stakeholders from education, community, and business begin to collaborate to really create new definitions of success that maybe are more in line with this current emerging era and that can ensure health across diverse populations. So our last driver is remaking geographies. And as we were looking across really our horizon scanning and our signal scanning, one of the things that came to the fore are, one, the idea that people are on the move for a variety of reasons, and that a shifting economy has really started to play havoc with what we consider a sense of place. So migration patterns, small-scale production, and efforts to grow place-based and cultural assets are really beginning to combine to reshape local geographies in response to things like economic transition and climate volatility. So many places are experiencing population change due to people moving and making relocation decisions based on things like housing costs, job availability, climate volatility, tax rates, public services, personal values, and that list can really just go on and on. And at the same time, many places are beginning to experience or exploring strategies to really reinvent a unique sense of place and transition it into a more sustainable platform for community viability, health, and wealth. So if we think about sort of moving away from big economies of scale that once gave us things like my city, the Steel City, or Detroit, the Motor City, and moving into sort of what we would consider pull or rather push-based economies that can respond by creating value webs that serve particular needs in sort of a post-manufacturing economy. This is most felt when we travel and we go to a place and I say, hey, tell me about your town. And that dialogue usually goes really into this education thing. We like our environment. We really like high tech, right? It really becomes like this really homogeneous, like broken record approach to describing a place. So if we look at that, if we look at current efforts to revitalize an economy, it usually falls into what futurists call a used future, right? I'm a failing economy. I need an anchor business. I'm going to make an 8-figure, 10-figure deal with Amazon. They're going to come in. We're going to pin all our hopes and dreams to that anchor business, and good times will follow. So what we've seen is communities kind of begin to really push back against this idea and think through how can they tap into their unique cultural and historical roots and leverage those small-scale production networks to make something that's unique to that community and create value according to that community's values. So a couple signals of change in this realm are the National Main Street Center and the Project for Public Spaces, both of which are partnering to support diverse placemaking efforts in town that do exactly what I described. So they work with the community to honor that community's unique cultural heritage and really begin to generate modern creative production networks in order to create sustainable value. We've also seen groups called Project for Public Spaces, Reimagining Civic Commons. We're doing the same thing, but looking at civic infrastructure differently. So how can we revitalize a park or reconceptualize public space to create informal spaces where people can kind of rub elbows in ways maybe they hadn't before, to think through what a civic project or a civic park could and should be, and begin to kind of co-create value out of public spaces. So looking at all of this, I think that to me, this is one of the more exciting drivers as we begin to think through education's role in placemaking. But according to this driver, one of the big questions that comes to my mind is really this idea of how might education play a leadership role in helping cities, towns, and rural communities begin to find a new signature identity. So how can education lead from the front in defining what it means in terms of creating a sense of place? So I'd like to run a brief poll, and again, I apologize for having to make up a little bit of time and sort of the technological failings in my audio. But based on what you just heard, what do you think presents the greatest opportunity for learning? If you had to narrow it down to one, or maybe perhaps it's none of these.
And after you've completed the poll, if you have any specific questions about the drivers of change, if you want to put those in the Q&A box, I'll pose those questions to Jason and Katherine for a few minutes.
By a margin of 4 points, Accelerating Brains is certainly looks like it's the leader here, followed closely by Civic Superpowers.
So Jason, one question that that we got actually in the chat box to talk a little bit more about in toxic narratives, kind of specify a little bit more around the metrics of success that we're talking about in that driver, and also clarify the idea of social pollution. So maybe just a little bit more detail in those two areas.
Yeah,
helpful.
Yeah, and those are great questions. So metrics of success. So if we think about, unfortunately, a lot of the times as a education system, specifically the K-12 system, relying on notions of just go to college and you'll climb the career ladder, things that haven't been true for a really, really long time. Yet we're still clinging to those things as notions of being a successful student and really capturing, you know, this is what makes a successful education institution, that don't always serve the student well. And I think that increasingly students have an awareness that maybe that this isn't a great fit. And then in terms of the social pollution, this was out of a book called Dying for a Paycheck, which I highly, highly recommend. But it's really just the breakdown of positive social connections due to strain, right? So, you know, my work-life boundaries are totally gone. I'm an anxious mess because I'm dipping in and out of the gig economy. Because of that, I'm losing those positive social connections with my neighbors and those that I might rely on just when I need help, right? And however we define help.
Thanks. Another question that is interesting is when we think about the drivers, and are any of them, do any of them feel particularly helpful in really moving us to authentic change in education? So we talk a lot about the need to change. Which of, if any of the drivers feel like they could really enable that change, or potentially drivers outside of the ones that we've identified? And either Katherine or Jason can take that question.
This is Katherine. I'll respond with two. So I do think that for all its grimness, toxic narratives could be a force for change, in that if we're seeing enough distress among enough people, that could be a negative impetus to course correct. You know, we might need to think really seriously about, for example, broadening our accountability systems to reflect a broader understanding of performance, or you know, shifting our expectations of what's happening in teaching and learning environments to be more supportive of learners' needs. The other driver of change that I think has a lot of potential is automating choices. If we were to think about using tools developed with artificial intelligence and machine learning in appropriate ways in education, and that's not a simple statement, but they could serve us to create a lot of efficiencies on the administrative side, so that we can really focus educators' attention on the relationships that we know are so critical for learning. And they could also help enable, along with other tools, some new structures for supporting learning, or new ways of pursuing certain learning-related tasks that might help us see beyond and implement beyond the ways we typically approach learning today.
And that relates to another question that we got just in terms of defining learning. So it just sort of a clarifying question for the purposes of our forecast. What is the definition of learning, knowing that that's a big question that we can't take on in just a few minutes, but just if there's any additional context about what we mean by learning and education that contributed when in the creation of the publication.
That's a good question. Yeah, I guess in terms of how we define it, or how we look at it as it relates to the publication, I think that we always begin sort of with this context for where and how learning might happen. So it's like change from the outside in, effects to learning, and then effects or implications for an existing system, particularly K-12. So if I'm seeing the question right, so how are we defining learning, what's learned, and how and what time frame for learning. You know, a lot of these don't point to a different way that somebody would learn in terms of like a biological process, or for maybe accelerating brains, but the context for which somebody would learn in, how they would access knowledge, how they would show knowledge, for sure.
And I would just add that we try to describe future possibilities that are useful to current systems and institutions, you know, K through 12 system, higher post-secondary institutions, community-based learning organizations, and so forth, while also trying to invite possibilities that the boundaries among those might shift, or that we might have kind of new kinds of learning organizations that don't yet exist. So really trying to take a broad view of where learning can happen, and also to be thinking about learning across a lifetime, although we are skewed toward the younger part of the lifespan.
Mm-hmm. And there are several questions that we don't have time to get to right now, but we will talk at the end about how we'll continue to engage in these questions. Two that I think are important, that one of which I'll address in the next segment, is how do these drivers relate to one another, which I think is a really important question, and then how might they apply to places outside of the United States. We do focus our research on the United States, but certainly can see some signals of change that are related to them outside of the US. So those are two questions I saw from several folks. I'll do my best to address the interrelationships in just a moment. And then we will have another question and answer session after this next segment. So I think we'll move on to the next part of the forecast, which we call provocations for the future of learning. And so, as Jason mentioned, the drivers of change are external to education. So they are things that are happening in the broader environment. So our next step in creating the forecast was to think about what are these things, what might they mean for learning? And more specifically, as Katherine alluded to, how might these drivers of change enable new practices, structures, programs, roles in education? So we took a look at the drivers, at their interconnections, tried to unpack some of them and recombine them into future possibilities, which we call provocations for the purposes of the forecast. And what we noticed as we were creating those future possibilities is that they clustered into themes. There were some ideas that continued to come up. So I'll highlight those themes and then sort of give you a sense of some of the provocations that fit within the larger themes. So the first theme of provocation is called signature learning ecosystems. So looking out 10 years, educators and partners could situate learning in place in ways that integrate technology, culture, learner and community identity to enhance and extend opportunities for learning alongside efforts to revitalize community. So this one, we certainly see the Remaking Geographies driver playing a large role, the CIVIC SUPERPOWERS driver playing a large role, combining together for this opportunity for learning and community building to really be an intertwined process. So one of the specific provocations or possibilities that falls under this theme is something we're calling nested learning, where diverse community organizations are actually hosting clusters of students for place-based learning experiences outside of the walls of school. So students are not only developing skills and competencies, but also developing strong social networks with local leaders, community members, mentors, peers, and trusted adults, and becoming very much a part of that community building process. A role that we see as possible for the future is something that we're calling community network builders that are fostering multi-stakeholder partnerships and cross-cultural understanding by mapping and modeling community networks, shared interests and goals, and potential collaboration. So actually an intentional role within a school or within some kind of learning organization that is using technological and social tools to try and build those connections. The next theme is called human-centered learning. And this really centers on the possibility of reprioritizing teaching and learning systems, expectations, and experiences to put a holistic view of human development at the center of education. So we might see the expansion and creation of true formative full spectrum assessments that really go beyond the quantification of academic performance to reflect a broader range of human development that supports students in understanding and growing their full intellectual, physical, creative, and civic potential. Another possibility under this theme is something we're calling cognitive fitness protocols. So as our understanding of neuroscience and our ability to understand brain health expands, we could see a scope and sequence of diagnostic and therapeutic activities and vetted tools that allow educators to support learners' neurological health and cognitive performance, and also potentially address the neurological impacts of factors such as trauma. So this one, when we're thinking about its connection to the drivers, we see things around accelerating brains, also civic superpowers, and toxic narratives if we're looking to really reorient and reprioritize our education system around different metrics and narratives of success. The third theme is one we're calling safeguards for efficacy. And this one really relates around a new vision and enhanced and improved stewardship of implementing effective data strategies and embracing emerging technologies in ways that intentionally support learners. So one possibility in this theme is something we're calling follow me schools, where students who might experience educational disruption due to climate relocation or other kinds of traumatic experiences that take them away from their homes or the places they live, that they might still be able to continue their education through flexible self-organizing schools that combine place-based learning opportunities, mentor and coach networks, and digital resources. So these schools would use a variety of technologies and resources to configure themselves around students wherever they may find themselves. Another future possibility in this theme is the idea that machine learning audits may become common practice in education. And these audits would aim to determine whether algorithms deciding educational or making educational decisions are interpretable, meaning we can understand how and why those decisions are being made, that they're based on unbiased data, and reflect fair assumptions about local communities. So could we have intentional processes that audit and monitor the technologies that we're using? And the final provocation theme we call amplified voice and impact. And this really envisions new engagement frameworks and communications channels that increase the individual agency of students and community members and educators and could increase community impact. So one provocation within this theme we call amplified student government, where we envision student government goes beyond the walls of school and their current role and really takes more of a leadership and governance role within a community. They may monitor other governance bodies. They could influence political candidates and shape policy issues that are relevant to them. Or we might see AI educator support bots that serve as personal digital partners that help educators enhance their practice. So vetting curricular resources, managing data, identifying personalized professional development opportunities, among other opportunities. So this is just not only just a portion of what we have in the forecast, but obviously just a portion of what possibilities might be available in the future or might be possible in the future, given the drivers of change and given the changes that we see on the horizon. And we present these possibilities not because we think that they're comprehensive or the only possibilities that are out there, but to spark thinking. And we hope that in reading the forecast and in thinking about them, you'll envision other possibilities and start to think about what else might we see in 10 years' time in education, given the changes that are underway. So we will do another poll right now about the provocations and the provocation themes. And if you have questions related to these themes, you can put them in the Q&A box. So it looks as if human-centered learning is the one that is most intriguing to folks. I know Katherine would relate to that one through our development of it. That's one that we've talked about a lot as being a major shift for education and how we measure success and achievement. The human-centered learning provocations certainly represent a different way of approaching our perceptions of those concepts.
So skimming through the Q&A, so first of all, thank you everybody for the questions, very much appreciative. There's a great question here from Harris, who asks, in each of the provocations, the challenges of biases becomes real, though perhaps in different ways. What safeguards or corrective mechanisms can you imagine emerging to allay biases in programming there, make them public? Even, for example, in the intentional processes discussed in the safeguards for efficacy provocation.
So I think the several of the provocations that we forecast address this, and I think that this is a huge issue, and obviously not just for education, but when we were looking at the automating choices driver, there are many aspects of society where we're adding these technological tools, machine learning algorithms, without really fully understanding how those decisions are made or how the data is used or where that data comes from. So I think the good news is that there's conversation about that. There are people saying we need to create frameworks for artificial intelligence. We need to understand how it works, and we need to understand those things before we begin to apply them to really meaningful aspects of our lives. So I think things like the machine learning audits are one possibility that we envision that could address this. I think we also need to look at the kind of values that are underlying some of the creation of some of these tools and who is involved in the decision making around what we use and when. So if we have only certain people deciding this is a great tool and they have blind spots and biases as well, that's going to take us to a place obviously that we wouldn't want to go. So it's partly in having in those safeguards, but also in some of the decision making and governance structures that we put in place. So that would be one start to what is a big question. So
this is more of a driver's question, but it came up twice in the Q&A, and then Carolyn moved it over to the chat box. So I'd like to address it, but the question is there any work being done on the dependencies of the drivers for change? And that question appeared a couple times.
So this is Katherine. I'm hearing this is a question about kind of how the drivers of change intertwine and depend on one another. Jason, is that how you hear the question?
That is, yeah.
As Katie mentioned, our exploration of provocations attempts to begin looking at a combination of how the drivers of change might intersect to create future possibilities. And also, as Katie mentioned, it's a partial illustration of what could unfold in the future. And others than us could no doubt identify many more future possibilities. So one tool we used and the others could also use in continuing to think about that would be kind of what we call a cross-impact matrix, where we kind of look at literally try to map out how could these two drivers of change intersect and so on and so on, and look at kind of multiple combinations to future possibilities. In terms of our work, we don't have a specific publication that's slated to dig further into the combinations of the drivers of change, but we do have planned for release in the summer a strategy guide that will dig further into the question of how do we respond to the change on the horizon to shape the future of learning. And we'll be creating that strategy guide with input from folks across the field.
And I would also add, as we work with different organizations and stakeholders in grappling with this material and digging deeper into it, that certainly is an area of exploration that could be interesting. How do these drivers relate to one another? How might they affect and change the trajectory of each other?
So there was a follow-up question from Carolyn, which I think is an excellent question too, in that what amplifiers are there?
Amplifiers of the drivers?
I believe that's what I'm hearing.
I think I would need to give some more thought to specific ones, but I think one interesting exercise could be to look at some of the, Katherine mentioned at the beginning that we look at social, technological, economic, environment, and political trends and signals of change. And one interesting thing to do might be to look at some of those larger trends that we're seeing. So for instance, demographic shifts that are happening, and overlay those with these drivers of change. How does the changing diversity of the population or the aging population affect any of these, or how might these drivers affect those larger trends as well? So I think there's any number of sort of cross comparisons that folks could do. I would need to give a little bit more thought to think about specific ones that are amplifying these drivers beyond what we've already identified, but it certainly would be an interesting exercise.
And then one more, and that was, does order matter in terms of the drivers?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we probably tried to pace ourselves, so we didn't put all the ones that had a big technological element at the beginning, just to try to kind of vary the texture of people's reading experience. And honestly, sometimes we just were arranging them based on like the titles and varying, the words. So as the structures of titles. So no, I think that we see them all as being parallel. And we could have put them in any order from a meaning point of view.
All right, so we have one last question because I realize we're about to run out. But Patricia asks, that says, thanks for your evolving work. I'm wondering how higher ed institutions are integrating these drivers of change to impact their practices and prepare educators. Can you share examples of these institutions?
I think that is an area where we would probably need to get into some more detailed follow-up. But the question of teacher preparation comes up very frequently as one of the the big levers for change that could really have a big impact in the K through 12 system. So that, yeah, I'll just say that for now, and know that that could be something we might need to dig further into to provide specific examples.
And we have an offer from one of our attendees who's also a futurist and an expert in higher ed, Brian Alexander. We may be asking him potentially to write a guest blog post about the forecast from a higher ed standpoint. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see some ways for you to continue to stay involved with us. And we are certainly going to keep all of these questions, knowing that we did not have the opportunity to answer or address all of them thoroughly. Use them to inform our own next steps, hopefully getting either back to folks individually or using your questions as inspiration for blog posts, for Twitter chats, and other activities that we plan to do. So if you would like to stay in touch with us, here are just a few ways. We do use the hashtag #NavigateFutureEd. If you haven't yet downloaded the forecast, you can do that at the link on the screen. You can also order hard copies of the forecast there. We will have this webinar posted on the website, so if you would like to share it with any other folks who weren't able to make it, that would be great. We created really short videos related to the drivers of change that can also be found on the website. Those can serve as little introductory points for people that you think may be interested in this. Our newsletter is going to be diving into a lot of content related to the forecasts in the coming months and years even. We just released the forecast a few weeks ago, so there's still so much more to dive into and discuss. And then coming soon, we're going to release an executive summary of the forecast and some discussion guides that you all can use to facilitate conversation about this content with other colleagues and stakeholders. And we hope that executive summary could also serve as an entry point for anyone who may want an entry into it, but not approach the whole forecast at once. But we do thank you so much for joining us, and hope that you'll stay in touch. You can get in touch with any of us individually. And as we said, we will be combing through your questions and using that as an opportunity to create some new content and to explore some other possibilities that you all have raised.
Thank you all for joining us.